Oh, hello. Today we are doing a recommendation video, which is so unusual for me to be in the mood to do that I knew I just had to strike while the iron was hot, and I still was interested in doing this because I know you guys really like recommendation videos. I like watching recommendation videos, but I don't know. I've not been as in the mood to do them in recent years, but I am today. And so we're just gonna do it. I am taking my inspiration from the fact that people have been talking a lot about that best books of the 21st century list from the New York Times. I was supposed to be a part of a collaboration for that and then just like could not get myself together to do it. So that's my bad. So that's my main inspiration, and also just thinking in general, like how do I give recommendations? Because I recently was doing some recommendations for Meg. I'll try and remember to link her video and let you see how that went. But anyway, like thinking through what are sort of like general recommendations versus person specific. My preference is always to give people specific, like personalized recommendations. That to me, like when I was a bookseller, I would always ask about like what people were interested in, what kind of other books they've enjoyed, what kind of other media they enjoyed, to get a sense of their preferences and kind of what speaks to them. And that's always the best recommendation, I feel, is to kind of go off of what somebody already likes and either give them more of that or kind of like lead them down a new but related path in reading. That's, I think, the best approach. At least that's my approach. And that's usually what I do when people are asking me for recommendations in the context of BookTube. But I was thinking about, because that's kind of how I was thinking about the New York Times list of like, well, they're trying to pick the best books and really ones that have like some version of like mainstream appeal. And to me, that often ends up like kind of leading to the least common denominator. It's the same reason why, in the Goodreads Choice Awards, we always, at least in, like, I'll take mystery because that's the one I usually have the biggest opinion on. It's like, these are the most, often, these are like kind of the like least common denominator that if you've read like 2 thrillers this year, you've probably read one of these. That I think ends up kind of often being what people are called to do in recommendations. And I kind of get out of having to do that because usually I can interact with the person and give them more like specific personalized recommendations. But I was thinking about if I had to give just like, I don't really know anything about this person, I just need to recommend like a book to them, what are the kinds of books I would recommend? So I'm calling this my best general recommendations. These are all books that I think are good versions of what they are. And if I don't know anything about this person, it's a like good enough version of what it is that even if they don't like it, I don't think they'll hate it unless they just end up hating that kind of book. So for example, if I were going to recommend a mystery to somebody who I know nothing about them other than I was recommending a mystery, what would I recommend? Now, if they end up just like not liking that subgenre of mystery or hating mysteries in general, sure. But I've at least given them what I think is a good representative of that kind of book for them to work off of. So I hope that makes sense. That's sort of my thought process here. And I thought I would divide this into sort of general fiction and nonfiction, which is what the New York Times list was very focused on. And then also some genre picks, because I think those don't get as much love, I feel like, in the I feel like people often are recommending general fiction to people or nonfiction, but less often will they take a swing and do some genre. So I decided to have roughly 10 genre and then roughly 10 nonfiction / general fiction. Okay, with all that being said, let's get into it. Let's start, I guess, with the general and nonfiction. So I picked 5 books for general fiction, and some of these are on the cusp of being in a genre, but they're like literary versions of genre fiction, so I decided to just keep them as general fiction. Okay, first, My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite. This book is short, so I think that also makes it very recommendable. I don't think that it makes a lot of sense to give general recommendations of super long books. I think you don't know enough about how much of a reader somebody is as if they'll commit to a long book like that. So it's relatively short. It has a very, you can tell from the title kind of what it's about, so you get the vibe immediately when you recommend this. And it is just a really good exploration of really weird family dynamics. like what family loyalty means, what kind of like family trauma systems develop. And it's also got a very humorous perspective. It, you know, even just the title, I think, is kind of conveys some of the cheekiness of the tone. It's a distinctive book. I haven't read a lot of books like this, but I think it's a really good example of general fiction that does have like a mystery plot to it. So there is plot in this happening, but a lot of this is very character driven still. Then I would say the book that I believe the New York Times picked as their all-time best of the century so far, My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. This is objectively one of the best books I've ever read. I didn't love it the way some people do, but in terms of just like a really solid character study that's in sort of a historical setting, really good writing, really good theme development throughout. This is just a really solid piece of work that if you're into fiction, I think you're minimally going to have an okay time. Like, this is a very, unless you just hate the project of this book, I don't see somebody not liking this. It's also in translation, which I think is exciting. There's that. Another one that is kind of in the realm of somewhat, like, you could make the argument that this is crime fiction of some kind, but I would consider this to be general literary fiction with a lot of discussion around crime, is Notes on an Execution by Dania Kukofka. I think this is also a little bit more experimental. So if somebody is up for something, maybe they've not read in a long time, or they've been reading and they're just looking for something a little bit different, I think that this has a little bit of an unusual structure. It's different people meditating on the life of somebody who is about to be executed as a serial murderer, and the writing is beautiful. It's an interesting book. But still has a lot of, it is still a very literary book. Yeah, I don't know. I just think this is really well done and could appeal to a lot of people. One of my go-to recommendations, if I don't know anything about somebody, is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is definitely my favorite historical fiction kind of book, and it's beautifully written, it's very character driven, and the themes are just superlative. The other book you could recommend, I would say either this or Never Let Me Go by the same author. Never Let Me Go is more of a boarding school with a speculative element literary fiction. This is an epistolary novel that is historical fiction. Both are I think especially because Ishiguro is an immigrant to the UK, he has a little bit of an outsider perspective, I think, or like challenges some of these kind of traditional hallmarks of English literature, like the country house book or like the English boarding school book. So I think he brings kind of a fresh perspective, but the writing's beautiful and the character development is just outstanding. And then I'm picking The Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. Now, I have not yet read The Glass Hotel, or what is the big one that she's known for, Station 11. So maybe Station 11 would be a better recommendation because technically those three books are interconnected. So I technically spoiled stuff for myself in Station 11, but I don't know that. And the person, because I haven't read those yet, and the person who I'm recommending this to theoretically may not also have read those. This worked just fine as a standalone. I think it's a great example of speculative literary fiction. It does play in the future. It has different timelines. It's somewhat about time travel, but it is still very beautifully written, very accessible. It's not like up its own butt literary fiction, which is really what I'm trying to avoid in this entire recommendation scheme. So those are some general fiction recommendations. Now let's move to nonfiction. Move some books around. So nonfiction. I should mention, maybe this should have been a disclaimer up top. My assumption, I'm not making any assumptions about this person in terms of like religious affiliation or their partisan political affiliation or their socioeconomic demographic. I am picturing a generally curious person looking for a book recommendation. That's really about it. Some of these nonfiction book recommendations have, at least in the US, some partisan political implications to them, but they are not, they are political in the sense of like the body politic, but none of these are explicitly partisanly political to my recollection. So just keep that in mind, especially in the nonfiction category. I think that is a relevant data point or like consideration. So I picked a few different kinds of nonfiction to represent here. So for essays, I thought a pop culture essay collection could be fun. So I picked It Came from the Closet, Queer Reflections on Horror. This, it's about horror movies. And a lot of people have seen a lot of these horror movies. So in terms of picking something that somebody is likely to have interacted with the source material for a good chunk of this, I think that this hits the mark if you're somebody who's watched scary movies in the past. It's just a good old-fashioned collection. And essays, I find, not everybody's cup of tea, but if somebody's open to it, I think this is a good example of pop culture essays. I picked 2 history ones. One I think could be a good general recommendation just because we all just lived through a big pandemic, and is The Great Influenza, The Story of the Deadliest Pandemic in History by John M. Barry. This is about the post-World War I Great Influenza pandemic, and it's a really interesting history of science, of culture, and kind of like coming at the post-war culture, and also just the history of medical developments here in the US particularly. I thought that was an interesting component. So I think this could be a good general history recommendation. And then in terms of just like really well researched, interesting, written, well executed, I put The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, The Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. I think that this is interesting in terms of taking something really banal like zoning laws and showing the history, like the kind of hidden history behind why they are the way they are. And yeah, just really well written and researched in general. I should say at this point, I didn't put this person on the list because I couldn't decide like which one book to pick, but in terms of a general history recommendation, Eric Larson does narrative nonfiction of history, different historical events. The Devil in the White City, I think, is his best known one. My favorite one I've read is In the Garden of Beasts, which is a history of the U.S. ambassador to Germany right before, like during the rise of the Third Reich. And yeah, so I've not loved his books enough to say like, oh, this is the one you should read. So, but in general, that is a go-to recommendation for historical nonfiction. A couple of memoirs, one of which I would give somebody a trigger warning before I gave it to them, because it is about domestic abuse, but In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado, because this has so much inventiveness to its form. Again, if somebody is looking for something a little outside of the box when it comes to memoir, I think that this is really good. Like I said, it is about domestic violence, but with that caveat, if somebody could handle that, this is just excellently done. And then probably my favorite memoir is My Life in France by Julia Child. Opposite end of the spectrum in terms of intensity and need for trigger warnings, but this is just a lovely, she's just a lovely person. It's very light and breezy and just a pleasure to read about her perspective on the world and food and love. So I think it's one a lot of people could really like. My pick for sort of sociological nonfiction is Do Nothing, How to Break Away from Overworking, Overdoing, and Underliving by Celeste Headley. This is kind of a combination of history, sociological analysis or cultural analysis, and philosophy. And I think it's short, but very impactful. And it covers a wide range of genres within itself. So, and then this is like bridging reportage and science writing, and business writing, I guess. Bad Blood, Secrets and Lies of Silicon Valley Startup by John Carreyrou. I think this is better. This is about the Elizabeth Holmes fraud. So it has like con artists, science, business, and like the All the President's Men reportage aspect. So all of that together, this is just a fantastic example of nonfiction that I think is really page-turning and interesting, has some current events in it. Yeah, I will say I didn't, speaking of the science and business writing aspect, I couldn't decide what to do for the science recommendation. Business-wise, I think Michael Lewis's The Big Short would probably be the one I'd recommend most, but yeah, I think he has a lot of that. And then the other category I should probably address in this that I didn't is travel writing. And that I would go to Bill Bryson for a general recommendation, because they're very chatty, very, you know, lighthearted and humorous takes. He has them for multiple places in the world. So if you're traveling to those places, they can be a good recommendation there. Okay, I've gone on too long in nonfiction. Let's move on. Okay, now we're going to the genre side of things. This was interesting. I was struggling to figure out the right approach for some of these categories. Because, again, I'm trying to imagine somebody who's open to these genres. And in some of these, I'm like, well, but if you don't like romance, you're just not going to like this. So it's kind of hard to square, you know, all those factors. But, okay, so my horror recommendation, I'm going to go with The Haunting of Maddie Clare by Simone St. James, because horror, I feel like, is so idiosyncratic in terms of how much of a scaredy cat you are, that this is a ghost, lightly scary horror that has some romance sprinkled in. It's got a historical setting. It's set, I think, in like 1920s Ireland. Oh, 1920s England, sorry. So it's like after World War I, so it has some historical fiction. You know, there's a little bit of romantic side plot, and then it's also just this ghost haunting. And the themes are good, the writing's good, so this is my sort of like safe horror pick. The other kind of like fantasy / horror pick I had was A Sorceress Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher, because this is fantasy, but it is based in sort of a Regency England-esque fantasy world. And then it does have some sort of horror elements thrown in. So I think as a fantasy novel with horror and romantic elements, it has a lot of different genre stuff happening. I think it's one of T. Kingfisher's very best books that I've read from her. And I think that this could have wide appeal. Yeah, all of this is depending, but I think for a fantasy world, this one is pretty approachable if I didn't know for sure somebody was into fantasy. Another fantasy pick is The Rook by Daniel O'Malley. This is more urban fantasy because it is set in a world recognizably our own, but with a magical, underground. It's got a mystery plot because somebody wakes up in somebody else's body and they don't know how they got there, and they got to figure out, WTF is happening. And it's got a secret society aspect, which I think is appealing to a lot of people. So I think this is a good, not a fantasy, but not set in a fantasy world. I should mention, I just realized I did not include sci-fi, and that's because all of the ideas I had for sci-fi, I just wasn't sure that they're broad enough picks that I actually really know for sure I could. I mean, I guess my default would be All Systems Red by Martha Wells. I guess that's my default general sci-fi pick. But I don't know that that is a good enough general recommendation. Anyway, we'll just leave that there. Okay, so then moving into romance. So my speculative romance pick is Sword Heart by T. Kingfisher, because it is a closed door, there's not too much explicit stuff in here, so if people are not comfortable with that, or you don't know if they are, it's good. It's just fun. It's lighthearted. It's got a fun fantasy world that they're romping around in, and God, I got her on here twice because I think T. Kingfisher is a sleeper hit among non-big readers. I think more people who don't read a lot would like T. Kingfisher. The other, and I guess this maybe I'll make this my sci-fi pick. That was my fantasy romance pick. My sci-fi romance pick, I was gonna go with The Innkeeper's Chronicles by Ilona Andrews. I guess you could also technically call the oh god, I forget what the series is called, but the one that starts with Burn for Me technically is kind of a superhero sci-fi romance story as well. So either of those I would pick for my sci-fi romance pick, because there is romance, but it's over multiple books, so it's not as, people are not used to a traditional HEA in one book kind of romance. It's a little more approachable. It has a lot of really good, interesting world building and sci-fi elements, so I think those could be good general picks as well. For my contemporary romance pick, I went with Take a Hint, Danny Brown by Talia Hibbert, because I think that this defies some of the stereotypes about what romances are like, what contemporary romances are like. I think Talia Hibbert's a particularly good writer. I think these are two really interesting and good characters. I just think that this is a great example of sort of like a rom-com, fake dating-esque kind of contemporary. And for my historical romance, I went with The Duke Who Didn't by Courtney Milan. I knew I wanted to pick Courtney Milan because I think her writing, the writing itself, is some of the best in romance. So I think that removes a barrier to entry for some. And then this is like a light-hearted version of what she does, but it still has the great themes and the great characters and the giggles and the, you know, kicking your heels together. Like, it's still super cute. So that is going to be my generic historical romance pick. Okay, and then let's end with mystery, shall we? You knew this was coming, so surprising no one. You gotta go with Agatha Christie. So my marple, if I knew nothing about somebody, the marple I would pick for them is the Murder in the Vicarage, because this is the marpliest marple that marpled. The narrator's funny. It definitely gives you the cozy vibes that I think people associate with marple, so there's that. And then I went with the ABC Murders for my I Know Nothing About You Poirot pick. Because it's a serial killer type story, I think people recognize that. I think Murder on the Orient Express is the obvious Poirot pick, but I do know some people find that boring because of all the interviewing in it. So this, I think, gets around that. There's a lot that happens. It's fast moving. You know, you got Hastings as the narrator. So those are going to be my Agatha Christie picks. And then finally, I don't have the actual copies, so because I have it as audio, but the Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman, I think, is a easy general recommendation. The audio is great. I do recommend these on audio if you are a US reader, because I think it conveys some of the humor better than the written page does. And if you like it, the entire series is great. So there's that. And then last but not least is The Broken Girls. I think that this is I just realized there's 2 Simone St. Jameses in here. There you go. This is just a really good paranormal mystery and a mystery suspense. Like, it's less of a thriller and more of a paranormal suspense. So I think it's a good version of that, and it has some great themes in it as well that I think are pretty well developed. Okay, those were all of my best. I don't know anything about you. I'm just trying to give you a recommendation, kind of book recommendation picks. I hope the concept of that made sense. I'm having major brain fog issue these days, so I hope that made sense. For my general recommendations for a general, we'll say American, just because I'm an American, so that tends to be the pool of books I'm pulling from. Don't know you, but you're interested in a nonfiction book, a general fiction book, a genre book. These would be some of my best kind of go-tos for that. Okay, cool. I think that's it. I gotta get going to work, finish up my coffee, and get to getting here. So I hope you guys are doing well. Let me know if you have any go-to books of, like, someone says, hey, you like to read, recommend me a book, and you can find out nothing else about what they like. What book would you recommend to them? Yeah. I think that'll do it for me. Hit the bell if you want to know when I post, because I'm pretty irregular about that these days, but I'm still here, not going anywhere. And yeah, I hope you guys are having a lovely day. I'll talk to you soon, and happy reading. Bye!